Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog. And today I'm joined by a member of Marxist Unity Group. I think you're still on the editorial board of Cosmonaut.
Yes. Yes.
You're also
editor-in-chief of Cosmonaut magazine.
right, and you are on the editorial board of the Democratic Left as well, I believe.
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So in the DSA. And
quite a bit to talk about today.
Yeah, we do. So this is gonna come out probably in the early spring, but we are in the heydays of new Trump winter in the first 3 weeks of his new administration. And I also found it hilarious and weird that normie conservatives and like Zoomers are throwing around the word Bonapartist. So I don't know how much influence we Marxists have had on social media, but our terms are now being casually used by people who don't really know what they mean. But
I think there's been an independent growth of interest in Bonaparte in the right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I find it interesting in that, well, how would I say this? Weird right-wing monarchism I've normally found to be like neo-Habsburg or neo-Russian Tsar or something like that. But there does seem to be this idea and this new interest in Bonapartism in so much that you can have all the fun of a monarchy and none of the baggage.
Right.
So you don't try to have a state or a saint take over, but you know, what are you making of this? How much are you seeing? I mean, because I've seen a lot more discussion of this in general before we get into the specific Marxist debates we were going to talk about today. But
I think the word fascism has been thrown around and is being thrown around a lot to describe what is happening with the Trump administration. And first, I think that I have my own thoughts on this, but a lot of people are kind of responding to that claim by, it's actually Bonapartism is really like kind of more accurately like what we're seeing right now. And I think there are parallels to Bonapartism in a lot of ways. But there's definitely the fact that the executive is kind of becoming this independent force above the other, parts of the ruling class. But at the same time, there seems to be just an aspect of it that's just a pure takeover of the state by a specific faction of the ruling class to kind of create this patronage system that all of these kind of tech capitalists can kind of unite around to directly rule through the executive. And I think with Bonaparte, it seems like the ruling class kind of just accepts him as like a necessary evil to restore order in the face of a potential working class revolt and out of the collapse of traditional democratic institutions. Or in this case, it seems like, the ruling class is in a lot of ways getting on board with this quite enthusiastically and really seeking to use Trump and the MAGA movement as a vessel for them to achieve certain interests.
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, I have been kind of like, I've been actually surprised at how much the bourgeoisie has been out to lunch on this one. On the other hand, it clearly seems like a faction of the bourgeoisie, the tech oligarchs, have like really asserted themselves in a major way, although in a way that actually renders Trump a lot more incoherent than he was the first time.
Yeah, it's an alliance between really the middle American, kind of white middle American rebels, and the tech capitalists,
Well, I mean, it's interesting in the sense that like right middle American rebels, their geoeconomic base is basically Sunbelt production and what I call true petite bourgeois, as opposed to the Democratic Party, which is professionals, aka structural petite bourgeois.
Right.
MC. People can use either one. I used to call them labor aristocracy. We had a discussion about that online. You actually
Yeah.
maybe it's not helpful to call labor aristocracy.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, whatever term you like want to use for it, it's basically, yeah, you're kind of the yuppies, basically.
Yeah. Unfortunately, and I say unfortunately because his recent output has been, in my mind, craven. Christian Parenti had the best discussion of the PMC, where he broke them down into categories and said, look, most of them are actually some kind of wage worker. You might even consider them quasi-proletarianized, but the liberal ones have some indirect or sometimes even direct relationship to the state. But that brings us to the tech oligarchs, who are by and large, their trillions are tied into government contracts. I mean, like, why they're profitable is rents and government contracts and back-end infrastructure stuff.
Right.
It is not actually the point of consumer service nor any clear commodity. In fact, who the fuck has been making hardware other than NVIDIA for like the last decade? So there's this weird shift because normally in the Michael Lind kind of Trump one view of the world, you had the true petite bourgeois and the Sunbelt declining productive areas against rentiers, financial capital, and the big bourgeois. But a faction of the big bourgeois attached to the rentiers have changed sides. And now it's like, I mean, in this point, it is like Bonapartism in that the base doesn't actually make that much sense, and it's already showing cracks. But we've been dealing with 3 weeks of, from the time period that we're talking, and probably several months by the time period this comes out, of blitz from these people. So, on one hand, we get the everything seems coherent because basically so much is happening. The Trump base doesn't have time to fight itself.
Right, exactly. Like, it's all happening so fast, the contradictions haven't really been able to work themselves through, which is, it's interesting that, the way the blitz nature of it does kind of seem to be about like pushing through all these radical changes so fast that their own base can't oppose them. Because I don't think the MAGA base necessarily wants to get rid of Medicaid.
No, they don't like the worker pop. I mean, it's interesting because Bannon's from the worker populist side, but it's his sort of shock doctrine thing. And I use that term advisedly because I actually think the Naomi Klein description of this is not actually accurate or good. But I do think there is something to the fact that Bannon thought we need a shock doctrine, but it's not really Bannon's side consistently administering the shocks.
Right. Bannon seems skeptical of the Silicon Valley guys, if anything.
Mm-hmm.
It seems, if anything, Bannon is like less important to Trump's thing now. Now it's like Elon is really more important than Bannon. And Bannon's, mad about that.
Right. So it's Bannon's strategy, but Elon's substance. And I have a lot of right-wing friends living in Utah, and I've heard a lot of theories, but a lot of right-wingers are confused and kind of demoralized. I had one freak out to me yesterday when he was like, what is this America first when we're gonna take over Gaza? For those who don't know,
it's absolutely
Trump just declared that we're going to mar Gaza Lago, the Gaza Strip, after ethnically cleansing optimistically 2 million, probably 1.6 to 1.8 million Palestinians. And I say optimistically because no one really knows how many Palestinians died in the last war. The Israelis are not giving us good numbers.
Right.
Trump seems to know that because he seemed to say, 1.6 million Gazans need to be relocated. And I was like, is this a tacit admission that 800,000 people got killed in the last year?
Yeah, and I mean, it's a lot of the MAGA people don't like this.
Mm-hmm.
it's easy to say that. I mean, I do think that MAGA is a Zionist movement, like it is, led by Zionists, but not everybody who's into MAGA, because MAGA is so many different interests, so many different, different factions are kind of part of it. And so you do have like a lot of the classic paleocon right, who are anti-Israel and are legitimately like anti-Israel. Like Pat Buchanan, he did not like Zionism.
No.
A lot of these paleocons who, kind of, were visionaries for a lot of the MAGA ideas, and we're not fans of Zionism. I mean, Nick Fuentes, he's obviously fringe. He does have some level of reach, and he was kind of like, at one point he was like the youth, kind of leader of MAGA at one point, until he kind of got pushed away from those circles. But he's been very anti-Trump because of all of this, and basically saying that like MAGA has been completely taken over by Silicon Valley oligarchs. And he even said that they're like using they're saying that instead of actually going after the real deep state, they're allying with the deep state and going after black women at the DMV, working at the DMV as like the deep state. And it is interesting. There is a lot of genuine anger for the right, but I think MAGA itself is very good at keeping people on board, despite that they're like kind of qualms with aspects of it, because it's part of it is the charismatic leadership of Trump.
I mean, yes.
It relies so much on the charismatic leadership of a single individual to kind of balance out all these different things and keep everybody on board despite all the contradictions.
Right. Before we get to the Marxist part, I do want to pick up on this, because this will make our historical analogies and why we care about talking about Louis Bonaparte, General Boulanger, Blanqui, Babeuf, all that shit. Like why is that coming up today? But I do think we have an incoherent coalition, that we have a bourgeoisie that I just frankly don't understand at this point. I mean, I have been flirting with the idea that bourgeois ownership is so structuralized that the big bourgeoisie now doesn't really even see itself as having a social mission anymore. And so we have these tech oligarchs and these subcategories that really dominate. But if you look at where the real wealth is, like, yes, Elon Musk is the richest individual, but BlackRock is like 5 times larger than Elon Musk's, private holdings. And it's very easy to forget that the old capitalists have their assets diffused over families and over different holdings. So you can't see basically only the nouveau rich show up on Forbes richest.
Yeah. That is it's just increasing socialization of this wealth, basically, but within the framework of bourgeois ownership, obviously.
Right. And so one thing that I think that this speaks to is that there is dissatisfaction with current inequality and stuff in such a major way that people who are not associated with the left can pick up on it, because the Bidenists managed to do almost nothing about it.
Right.
And this would be the third round of major liberals not really doing anything about it in our lifetime, even within their pathetic frameworks. So it stands to reason that some kind of right populism would emerge. We talked about the F word. My unpopular opinion is the F word, the fascism, is a subset of Bonapartism anyway.
Right.
Like, I think Bonapartism is like almost a liberal norm. And what we're seeing right now, you can call it fascist or not. There are elements that fit, there are elements that don't fit. What we're really arguing when we have that debate is, what do we think are the most important elements of fascism, not really what all they are. And we've seen liberals use that as a motivating factor for a long time, and it does feel like that just won't work now. Ironically, when we're in a more authoritarian phase of this Trump regime, the appeals to fascism have less rhetorical weight. Because also, I mean, let's be honest, the liberals didn't really seem to believe it.
Right. Yeah. Resistance liberalism was just such an utter political failure and travesty. You know, I mean, I've seen people try to claim otherwise, but the fact is that it rested so much on, first of all, a conspiracy theory that Trump was like a Putin like puppet or what was installed through, you know, election interference, but also that in a way they overinflated the threat in a, you know, kind of the boy cried wolf aspect, where they kind of they overinflated the threat in the most kind of unserious aspects of Trump. Like they focused so much on the things that weren't really like a danger, like a lot of focuses on decorum and things like that. And that, you know, the way that they actually like handled Trump and the way that they obviously rested on completely on like defending the existing institutions that you know, kind of created so much discontent that gave Trump appeal as well. And, you know, it essentially weakened, you know, the ability for people to really actually resist this shit when it really did come back kicking way harder. But I think reading the How Draper on Boulanger has that, I think that's how you said it, and the influence or the dialogue between Engels and Paul Lafargue was really interesting to me, and because I guess we should kind of talk about first who Boulanger is and why we thought we should kind of talk about Engels's approach to him for this episode. But
I think first let's get into you're like Boulanger. We got into the two things. What is Bonapartism and what is the dictatorship of the proletariat? I went on this rabbit hunt myself separately from this conversation because it's mentioned in one of Hal Draper's books on the dictatorship of the proletariat and what's not meant by it. And
that's volume 3, right?
Well, it starts off in the from Marx to Lenin book. Then I went to volume 3. So I went through this stage. So I went to the Marx and Lenin book, and it's mentioned in a paragraph and not like Draper doesn't explain it. So you go to the footnotes and it says look at volume 3. So I went into volume 3 and Draper kind of explains it, but I actually had to go to volume 4 to get all the context. And the reason why is it looks like the Lafargue family burnt Engels's letters.
Yes. That's what Draper claims, is that there's a bunch of missing letters from Engels where he's like really like, you know, critical of Lafargue.
And we don't, I will say we don't know that. But what we
that
was
kind of like where I was like, I don't know. That seems a little like you're kind of wish casting, but nonetheless, like there was.
But we do have the Laura Marx Lafargue letters, which do make it clear that Engels was criticizing Paul Lafargue to at least Laura, but we don't know if he was doing it to Paul. It does seem like a mixture of wish casting. The only thing I'll say is going through volume 4, Draper actually does show you a letter that Paul sends back that seems to be responding to either a letter or a statement that we don't have. But that's the only hard evidence we have about the direct correspondence. But the correspondence with Laura Marx Lafargue is pretty clear. Engels was pissed off. So
right.
So let's go into that. But I mean, let's go into.
So what is Engels so pissed off about?
Well, the question is for me. Let's go back and what is Bonapartism? Bonapartism is really only mentioned in the Brumaire and then in subsequent letters and becomes a big category afterwards. It is interesting to try to figure out what separates Bonapartism from just general Caesarism, which is just, you know, because it does seem to me that Spencer Leonard is right in his introductions to the two books he wrote on Marx and Imperialism and Marx on Bonapartism, that for Marx, imperialism is the foreign policy of Bonapartism, which is this degraded our conflictual liberalism. And even the kind of normie bourgeois political scientist, I always look back to make sure, because this guy has 2 last names. It was just Ryan Allen or Allen Ryan. But anyway, says that if you read Marx, you kind of get 2 theories of the state. One theory is what you get when he's describing England, because the bourgeoisie is relatively in line with each other in England, and it really is sort of like a smoothly running ruling committee of the bourgeoisie. Whereas in France, the ruling committee of the bourgeoisie is kind of at war with itself constantly, which leads to Louis Bonaparte coming to represent this kind of appeal to everyone and no one, particularly according to Marx, relying on the lumpen proletariat. And we get a couple of different theories about what that is in Marx, actually. I could go through them, but it's not so pertinent here. But also the petite bourgeoisie. And then the bourgeoisie gets kind of accepted as a way to restore order, even though it's
and the lumpen proletariat is very key to the Bonapartist regime as well. But yeah, the way I kind of understand Bonapartism, if I was going to just kind of summarize it really quickly, would be it's a situation where, in a kind of situation of social breakdown, where the proletariat is not able to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, but the bourgeoisie is not able to establish its own stable form of rule in a kind of bourgeois constitutional republic. And so as a result, the a kind of third force arises, and that kind of has a semi-autonomy from both of these classes. In the case of the classic Marx theory, it's really the peasantry that he sees Bonaparte resting upon. And then he sees Bonaparte as kind of mobilizing the lumpen proletariat and the petty bourgeois, in order to secure power. But then the bourgeoisie eventually do come on board because they see Bonaparte as a means of restoring order and maintaining property rights against any kind of threat from the left. And so, in a way, and this is actually kind of used by Trotsky to kind of define Stalin as a kind of Bonaparte. And one of his some of his earlier stuff on Stalinism actually kind of moves from that analysis. But there was other left oppositionists who actually kind of had a similar theory that Stalinism, in a way, the rise of Stalin, is kind of like a result of like the failure of the proletariat to secure a stable dictatorship, but also the failure of the bourgeoisie to like secure a stable dictatorship in response. So the theory of Bonapartism is it's used a lot in Marxism, and you see people like Thalheimer, who was a right oppositionist in the Comintern, argue that that fascism is a form of Bonapartism, which I think is a pretty compelling theory, and I think it does make a lot of sense.
Yeah, I was about to say the right opposition theory of fascism, of the like 5 theories of fascism I've found in Bonaparte in Marxism, seems to be the one that actually does make sense to me, whereas the other ones, like, okay, like fascism is capital and the K, like, true, but that just doesn't tell you much. Right. Fascism is a form of financial capitalism, as picked up by the the
Dimitrov definition, the most reactionary dictatorship of the dictatorship of the most reactionary monopoly finance capitalist.
Yeah, which, to
be quite frank, kind of describes what's happening right now.
I was about to say, I think it's true for right now. I actually think it's not a good description of Hitler or Mussolini, but
right.
But to bring it back, I mean, the thing is, Bonapartism and Marxism is a contested term. And I think you and I would also say one of the hard things about dealing with Bonapartism is it's not entirely reactionary. There are elements of it that we would recognize from a Marxist perspective would be somewhat progressive if, for example, taking certain kinds of reform seriously, cutting down against government bloat and waste, depending on the situation. There's all kinds of things that we might say. It's not inherently solely bad, but that seems to lead people to argue that maybe there's something like a Marxist Bonapartist project, so that we could adopt, like, be a Marxist and not have like a dialectically sophisticated view of Bonapartism, but just say, okay, we're just to jump on the Bonapartist train.
Right.
And what Draper was spelling out, I think Boulanger is one of the clearest sections of this, but like, A, that's hardly ever gone well for Marxists when they try to do that. And B, we've been tempted to do it our entire history, going back to Louis Bonaparte. But I think the most clear example that Draper thinks, at least in volumes 3 and 4 of Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution, for those of you who want to know what we're talking about, seems to be the Boulanger and the French left, where there was an alliance between the Guideists, or the French Marxists, who weren't, and the Blanquists, where a subsection of Guideists, not Guidet himself, and a subsection of Blanquists decided to get on this kind of war populist general figure called General Boulanger.
Yeah. Well, Boulanger himself, he was involved in the he was kind of made a name for himself in the suppression of the Paris Commune.
Right.
And then he was able to become a brigadier general, and then was part of the he became a government minister and made a lot of reforms that were popular with the military, including letting people have beards. I guess that was actually funny enough, which is funny how he kind of used culture war issues to kind of, if you think about it, like that kind of does sound like a kind of culture war issue of
19th century culture war issue. Yeah.
Yeah. But I thought that was funny how that was kind of like one of the examples of like the kind of things he would use to get people on his side. But yeah, he kind of, and so he kind of creates this, this kind of, yeah, he's this populistic movement in a way of Revanchism towards Germany. Like that was one of his big things, was he he wanted Revanchism over the defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. And so it was very much inflaming French chauvinism and trying to essentially obviously get territory back from Germany, but just generally like pursue a policy of rearmament and increasing the role of the military, and but mixed with populist appeals to the working class. And that was like that was an anti-corruption, especially a lot of anti-elite, anti-corruption sentiment. And I think that was where the temptations from some of these Marxist and Blanquist towards the Boulanger movement came from.
Yeah, and so what we get in Draper is this really under-discussed example of what we might call anachronistically a red-brown alliance.
Right, exactly. It is kind of the first red-brown alliance, because, and we'll get in, I guess we can get into the kind of rationalizations and exact positions that were held. I mean, Draper does a really good job of them going into those, but right, you do see, this Boulanger guy, because he's, there's a third republic is formed in the blood of the Paris Commune. But nonetheless, it is a republic. It's a compromised republic. It's, as Engels says, the empire without the emperor. But nonetheless, there is a strong threat of royalist reaction. There are a lot of royalists who do want to completely scrap away with republican institutions entirely. And so, you have a situation where Marxists in France are obviously not, or just socialists in general, communists in France, and we're obviously not happy with the republic that they have. But so this rising figure of Boulanger is very much, he's feeding on resentment and dissatisfaction with this republic. And so there's this temptation that we can kind of ride the heels of this movement to discredit the republic to our own advantage. And so yeah, this is exactly like the MAGA communist argument.
Right. No, I mean
And
it's identical, and it's also one of the first cases of what Lenin would call tailism, where you take right-wing cultural issues that may be popular amongst certain elements or people adjacent to the working class and try to incorporate them in, even though you don't really believe in them, to build a broader coalition. And what I find really fascinating is while Marx doesn't use that terminology, it's clear that they're worried about it pretty early on. I mean, one of the things that we have to deal with when we're reading Marx and Engels is a lot of the terminology that we use after the Second International isn't developed yet.
yeah,
So like certain things are described, but we don't call them that. Like we're not saying tailist in 1880, but but Marx was clearly upset about it. I mean, I've also got my readings where Marx seems to be a very, and I think Draper's good on this, but I've also just read the letters, like very hesitant to be like, we should join in governments with bourgeois forces, like as under ministers, unless we're, there's a very clear, like you can make alliances, but don't join a government, a capitalist government, which is maintained until 1910 in the Second International, and after that they give that up. Once Ebert comes up and Hilferding gets finance minister, we give up on all those prohibitions, but it's maintained for a long time. Mike Nair makes a lot about this, but I think it's important to see that there is basically a after Boulanger us attitude about some of the Gadaists, particularly Marx's son-in-law, Paul Lafargue.
Right.
Who seems to perpetually piss Marx off.
Yes.
It's actually like reading, like every time I see Paul Lafargue mentioned,
Engels
or Marx are like, Engels or Marx are yelling at him. It's like,
So basically, like, you have the position of the possibilist in the French Socialist Party, who are in the French Socialist movement, because I think the party is still kind of coalescing in this period, and that's actually one of the factors that Draper brings into this as well. Why Engels was so interested in this issue was because he kind of saw getting this issue right as really important for coalescing the class independent, socialist movement in France, but nonetheless was not apathetic around the question of democracy in the republic. And so you have the possibilists, who are basically, the reformist socialists, who basically very much want to just do an unconditional defense of the Third Republic and unite with the bourgeois liberals and the petty bourgeois radicals, and essentially the Popular Front strategy is essentially what the kind of possibilist strategy is, and that's their reaction to this.
It was actually interesting to me because I always think of the Popular Front as an invention of the French Communist Party in 1936, later on picked up by the Soviet Comintern. But I actually was learning from doing this that, like, the reformists have tried the Popular Front many times before 1936. Right. Like, it's not even a new strategy. It's just not incorporated into Marxism until 1936.
Right, or at least what we understand as Orthodox Marxism, because Orthodox Marxism is basically forged in opposition to this strategy. And so, you have like the kind of the obvious reformist position. Then you have like what we were saying, which is like the Boulanger Marxists, or the Boulanger communists, or whatever you want to call them, who Paul Lafargue is very kind of close to. There's other people who take it further than him, but his kind of position seems to be that, like, we can't criticize Boulanger because that will make us look like we're siding with the radicals, which in this case, the radicals are basically like Republican liberals. And we can't and essentially, and what we need to do is we need to kind of try to take advantage of the discontent that the Boulanger movement represents, discontent with the Republic in this case, which is so we need there's this kind of position. It's like, well, there's it's obviously a movement that's led by this like laughable grifter guy, and he is a very laughable guy. It seems like from what I read that he really wasn't like someone who could a leader capable of actually rising to the occasion necessary, but nonetheless it's kind of like what he represents is real discontent, and he'll basically like discredit the Third Republic and allow us to sweep in and win his followers over and take power. So we shouldn't put any kind of energy into trying to defend Republican institutions. Instead, we should try to like capitalize on this dissatisfaction with Republican institutions and kind of try to ride that to power. So yeah, it's like a kind of after Boulanger us. And it's also a kind of like because it kind of the same time, like what Draper says is like, but at the same time, like whenever like Engels would accuse Paul Lafargue of like supporting Boulanger, he would like deny it and deny it. No, I don't support Boulanger. I don't support Boulanger. I'm just saying that his movement represents a kind of populist uprising that we need to reach out to, which is exactly like how the MAGA communist types talk about Trump. Like they'll always be like, no, we're not saying like we support Trump. We're just saying we support the MAGA movement that Trump is merely co-opting, and you go to McDonald's for the burger, not for the clown, and Trump is just a clown, So we're and if you ever actually like criticize MAGA or criticize Trump, you're always accused of just being a Democrat. It's the same kind of dynamic basically. Where
right. I mean, I don't know. The MAGA communists aren't even the only group that's done that to me. There's another.
No, it's not the only. They're not the ones who invented it. I mean,
right?
A lot of people were doing that kind of stuff like years before they were.
Right. I mean, it's actually not like I've gone back and found it pretty early on, and often it's just interesting. What one of the tells for me for one of these groups is when you point out unpopularity, or when you're tailing liberal and or progressive and modern parlance forces, they will call you out. But when you are tailing right-wing forces, they will make excuses for it, and there's really nothing like the standards are radically different. And one of the things that it is clear that we know from Engels' letters to Laura Lafargue, Marx's daughter, is that the chauvinism of Greater France was like a deal breaker for Engels. It's like we should never embrace that.
Yeah, no, he like in all the letters that we have available about this from Engels, he's basically like, yeah, this. Like, how could you possibly like align yourself with this kind of Greater France chauvinism? Like, this is just ridiculous. Like, this goes against all of our principles as internationalists,
Right. Which is interesting to me, because one of the things that I've seen from these kinds of groups is Marx says that we have to consolidate as nations before we have internationals. And he does say that in the manifesto.
Right.
But what is interesting is, like, even if that's true, Marx never endorses you encouraging national chauvinism within your own country, like, ever. I can't find a single instance where he says that's a good thing to do.
Right. I mean, you can find examples of chauvinism from Marx and Engels, but it's it's not like a lot of times, usually in their private letters.
Right. No. Yeah. I mean,
actual prescriptive political programs, you'll never find like any kind of like tactical endorsement of like any of that.
No, I mean, you get stuff about the historical peoples. You get there are some weird racial ideas in Marx and Engels. Let's be honest. Eric Van Rie's written about it relatively well, but I would tell people that even though that's true, it is amazing how much they do not want any of that informing their movement at all. Right. So, like, even though they might think, I mean, there's even reasons for that in their racial ideas, but even though they might think like the Slavs are a non-historic people, or like the Irish are uppity or whatever, are things that they say about the Mexicans aren't great either. But they don't want national chauvinism to be a defining point of the movement, And from what I read from Van Ree, even their racial ideas, I think that like racial intermixing will actually solve a lot of the quote racial problems. So any encouragement of national chauvinism would actually cut against that. So even when they are chauvinists, they're at least not the people who are like, well, only, only hang out with your own kind. In fact, they seem to think like, well, if the English like intermarried, maybe they wouldn't be so brain dead. I mean,
yeah, no, there's all kinds of weird crank stuff you can find throughout Marx and Engels, but it's not the stuff that people use to define historical materialism.
Absolutely, and it almost never comes up in political documents.
Right. The anti-chauvinism of Engels is very clear in these letters. He's very much, and saying you can't align yourself with this just kind of blatant chauvinism. But with a lot of these like leftists today who are like soft on MAGA, to them it's almost like, oh, look, you being so bothered by all this chauvinism is just your own petty bourgeois PMC leftism that can't handle the true feelings of the working class, like.
Well, this is one of the interesting things. I don't know who the fuck these people think the working class is.
Yeah.
One, the idea that there are no trans people, or no queer people, or no people of color amongst the working class is weird. But then, some of these groups will define working class either in a way that is Marxistly honest but problematic, which is just saying, none of this is a class in itself, it's a class for itself. Okay, fine, but then why the fuck would we want to like tail, chauvinistic attitudes in the class now if we're trying to build a class for itself? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
The other thing you'll get is like the productivist mentality, but then there's weird breaks because, the most famous example is people who only believe in industrial workers count, which would only be, by the way, about 12 to 15% of the U.S. population.
Right.
But then they'll add like the petite bourgeoisie as proletariats, but service workers don't count.
Yeah, and there's all kinds of bizarre like ways to kind of try to redefine the working class to only include like jobs that they find like masculine enough. But
yeah, which is interesting because, to be fair to our weird tailists from the 19th century, they didn't have to do that. Like, they didn't have to break the definition of working class to make this stuff work.
Right.
If anything, some things are still unsettled. Like, I will say, for example, reading the debates in the Second International, thanks to scholar Clive Burrows, I've discovered that like people really couldn't figure out what the fuck service workers were even in the 19th early 20th century. But
absolutely.
But the reasons for that are different than our reasons. It wasn't cultural reasons. It was because they didn't have work half the year, and we were trying to figure out if only the formal sector of the working class counted, only those who had formal employment. But then that's a problem if you know anything about the history of capitalism, because there is no formal employment till the end of the 19th century. Everything's informal. So it's like, it's very hard to come up with hard definitions that we like today. I mean, one of the things that Trotskyists will sometimes do, for example, is that, just so you know that I do pick on Trots, is try to come up with the distinction between class and caste. That doesn't exist in Marx. And if you read Lenin, it's not clearly there either, because Lenin says class is also legally defined, not just economically defined. So, like this idea that there's like, well, there's caste, which is what is legally defined or socially defined, and there's class, which is only economic. That's not in Marx and Engels, and it's not in Lenin either. That's a later development.
Right.
And this matters for trying to figure out who's a Bonapartist, because if you don't know who the working class are, you also don't know who the lumpen and the petite bourgeoisie are. The bourgeois may be obvious, although in our case, I would say even that's not obvious, which is why the PMC thesis, I think, has so much purchase. You and I actually have come to an agreement that we both know what people mean when they say PMC.
Right.
And we both think there is a thing they are describing that is real. What what you and I think agree on is like, but it's not a coherent class. And every time you try to make it a coherent class, you end up like with weird definitions that don't really make a lot of sense and have nothing to do with how the term is broadly used.
Right. Well, I think it speaks to just a deeper need for more theory on bureaucracy in Marxism, because I think a lot of PMC is basically like the kind of the bureaucracy. But yeah, no, I think with these definitions of classes, I mean, I think it's easy to get far too in the weeds about it.
Oh yeah.
And
I don't think it's helpful to get, I mean, like, you and I, even though I think value theory is important, you and I are both on the table as saying, if the only thing you care about in Marxism is figuring out the precise form of the value theory, well, then Marxism is not going to be interested to 99.99.9% of the population, including most of the Marxists. And I think
with Marx, like the use of class analysis is not so much to define where every single individual lies within any given class, but he's looking at individuals' motion in society in aggregates. He's looking at people as acting as aggregates. And he's always very attentive to the fact that like these classes aren't always acting as unified classes. Often it's fractions of classes acting in league with fractions of other classes, for example.
Right.
And so I think when looking at these definitions of class, I think you have to always be going between the abstract, kind of definitions, structural definitions, but then returning to the actual kind of motion of these classes in history, which is very difficult. Like that's, it's not easy. It's not easily done, but I think that's kind of why the Marxist analysis of Bonapartism is so compelling, because he's looking at all these classes in motion and in interaction with each other. And he's looking at how all these precise kind of class strata and class alliances create what's essentially a kind of novel political phenomena.
Well, yeah, and I actually think it becomes really important. One of the reasons that I think about this is if you're to read Capital Volume 1 to 3, you would think there's like 3 classes: peasants, the bourgeois. I think petit bourgeois are mentioned, but it's not really that worked out, and the working class. And that's it. And when you actually read the political writings, you get something like I think John Elster, who's I don't love his politics, but he did actually go through and count in all the Marxist texts what kind of class formations you got. And if you include class formations and social categories, which is actually a thing that emerges later to make sense of categories that Marxists use that don't have anything to do with political economy, what you get is like 16 classes mentioned or something. And I think you also get clearer politics and the implications of politics in the Brumaire than figuring anything out from. I mean, I don't think Capital has that many political implications, to be frank.
Well, like Capital literally ends like at the very, like it literally ends in the middle of trying to define class.
Right.
And that's where the book breaks off, and the manuscript is Engels is like, yeah, I can't really edit the manuscript anymore.
Right. We don't have like Engels gives up. Marx doesn't come back to it. It breaks off right there. So we don't have a definition of class. I think there are reasons for that, actually, that like dialectically, Marx never really figures out the exact line between the productive and the non-productive eventually. And even his examples given the one I like to refer to, I think is in Capital Volume 2. But he mentions teachers, and he talks about how they're productive when they work for a private school, but when they work for the state, they're unproductive, because the only thing that's mentioned that productivity is dealing with is like whether or not it generates
a surplus value,
or it takes from surplus value. It doesn't have any social valence whatsoever, and it's not about physically making commodities. Like that's the other thing.
No, it's very simple. Like if you hire a house cleaner,
Mhm.
you know, personally, it's not productive labor, it's just an expense. But if you were to hire if you were to start a company hiring out house cleaners and making a profit off of renting them out to other homes, then they would be productive laborers because they're producing surplus value and that's being realized as profit.
Yeah. So
Like that was always a fake debate for me. I think it was always just clear that like the people who were like trying to argue like that like baristas aren't like proles or whatever because they're not productive or whatever. It's just bad faith. Like
it's bad faith. Although I think, ironically, it's not a new problem because of the debates around productivity and Maoism, and I think Matt McNair is actually somewhat infamous for like going after the late Maoists for saying you guys just invent class categories when you have a social problem.
right.
Like, so you come up with new class categories and make that work, but really you should just talk about the social problem. That's McNair in his critique of, but it brings it up in critique of Maoism. He also brings it up in his critique of Catherine Liu.
Yeah. It's like you think every bad political idea in the left is like due to the PMC, like influencing the left too much. But like perhaps there are just bad ideas in the left that should be like critiqued on their own merits and not as like you know, an infecting class ideology.
Right. So I guess this brings us today why we wanted to talk about it back to where we started is like there are a bunch of Marxists who seem to think either from some kind of anti-systemic want just for any action that seems to go against the status quo, or from some kind of left Bonapartist want, or an acceleration. There's multiple logics that get you here.
Right.
I think the weirder one that I'm not going to say who actually holds it because they'll probably deny that they hold it anyway, but is the argument that Marx and Engels thought that Bonapartism and imperialism was the same thing. I agree, by the way, about that. Then maybe imperialism is good because it could spread bourgeois culture throughout the world. And then once we take over bourgeois culture, we can flip the switch and turn the entire world communist. I think that's what they mean. So therefore, also supporting Bonapartist figures in a liberal country would be good because it would be pro-imperial. That's the weirdest form of this argument.
I think I know who you're kind of referencing.
Yeah, you know exactly who I'm referencing. I'm just I don't know that they actually believe that, but they have implied that argument. So,
well, I think okay. So there's a kind of I think let's go back to because you have people in the left since 2016 who have kind of been making arguments similar to the one Lafargue makes regards to Mac. You have Chris Gatrone infamously writes the "Why Not Trump" article where he kind of makes a similar argument that Trump is like shaking up the status quo of bourgeois politics, and so it kind of represents.
He writes it 3 times even.
Yeah, he's rewritten the essay multiple times, but yeah, the first opening silo, the argument, as far as best, correct me if I'm wrong, but the argument basically kind of comes down to like a similar kind of Lafargian argument that like he's shaking up this corrupt, republic and kind of creating an opening for real socialists to kind of step in and build something alternative by kind of disrupting the republic and disrupting this kind of fake bourgeois liberal system that we live under. And then you remember the anti-politics people like Tad?
Oh yeah, I still remember. I'm still in Tad Teza being the most famous. He became kind of notorious Trump apologist in 2020 and has seemingly gone away. I mean, he had a book that was supposed to come out from Verso that has also never come out.
Yeah.
So,
I think I came across him and I thought I saw him kind of like pushing like MAGA talking points, but
yeah, I have too.
I do remember there was kind of that crowd. You had Grant from Swampside Chats, and they ultimately left Swampside Chats, I think, and you had Dr. Tad, and their whole thing about like Trump represents this kind of like anti-political impulse that is, you know, like I remember you know
and Ted had argued that about Islamicism priorly in the actually as well, which is, I think, is
that's
interesting.
interesting.
Like he had argued that the Arab Spring was an anti-political force, and that the Islamicist part of the Arab Spring was proof that it was anti-political, which it's a weird reading. So it
really
wasn't
weird,
even the
mean,
first time
like,
he'd done that. Go ahead.
Did your screen
Can you see me?
break up? Yeah, I can see you.
Yeah. Let me
Can you hear me?
So yeah, I mean, so you had the spirit of the anti-political people, and like I said, some of them were looking for other things that represented anti-political impulses, Islamicism, Occupy, whatever. But it increasingly got the counter-systemic complacently seemed towards the right. There's the third iteration of the post-left. They also believe something similar to that.
Right. Yeah, you had the post left, kind of the Bernie fallout. You had a lot of people who you got off the Bernie train and got on the Trump train because, you know, they felt like they just got completely alienated with the left. They felt like the left had completely folded out to the liberals, and you know, you're basically the only way to oppose liberalism was now to basically join MAGA and join the culture war of MAGA, basically. You know, that was and that kind of feeds into the Peter Thiel backed fake counterculture of Dime Square that they tried to kind of astroturf into existence. And you know, so you had that, and then most, you know, I think the most developed and like articulated explicit form of it was basically like the MAGA communists.
Yeah, I think they're the people that we're really directly aiming at. The other people that are indirectly or have plausible deniability, or maybe they change depending on the situation. I mean, like, one of the things about the Why Not Trump is 70%. Like, I actually found the first Why Not Trump article to be kind of reasonable, but they got progressively less so. And there's what, 3 of them? I mean, if you don't include the Why Not Greenland article, there's 3 of them. If you include the Why Not Greenland article, there's 4.
Right. Yeah, I think what's interesting is there still is the plausible deniability the MAGA communists try to have. Like, they always try to say, like, we never actually supported Trump. Like, we never actually supported Trump. It's about the MAGA base. Whereas, like, you know, and then the Greenland article and the Catrone article for Compact, like, Catrone still tries to do plausible deniability on that article and say, I'm not really advocating for it. I'm just saying, why not?
Right. I mean, well, that's the thing. Like, I actually found that article infuriating, not just because of what it argued. I actually found it infuriating because the first half and the second half directly contradict each other, and they're not even presented as nuances. It's like they're presented as direct assertions, and then direct assertions, which I get caveat the first assertions to the point that they almost negate them, but not quite. And it's just like, okay, what do you mean? And I know that Catrone said on both Theory Underground and on Catrone's own or Sublation Media or whatever he does over there. I listened to these clips. I didn't listen to the whole speech, so I can't contextualize them. But that it was part of it was the editing of the piece took away some of the nuance and the humor. And I'm like, okay, fair, but like, it still seems like you're trying to have your cake and eat it too. Yeah. And we see this with the MAGA communists too. I mean, I don't really know what they entirely want, except to use slurs and have a Fordist social compact or something. Like,
well, well, these people are playing with fire because, associating yourself with Trump, it's like you want to associate with him to get on the populist bandwagon and get the good stuff. But at the same time, associating yourself with him, you're going to be associated with all the terrible things that he's going to do that you admit are terrible things in many cases. Like obviously the MAGA communists are all like talking about how terrible it is that Trump, what he wants to do to Gaza, obviously because they have to be pro-Palestine. But at the same time, they're like talking about how we need to like support RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, and how Trump is, how we need to take control of MAGA for our own purposes, take it away from Elon Musk. And there's just like organic, wholesome populist movement there that we can just kind of co-opt, and that it's not just a kind of grift of these oligarchs like Trump and Elon Musk, but there is this kind of authentic working class movement there.
Yeah, basically, they seem to think that like the Bannon end of the paleoconservative end of the Trump world has some kind of authentic. I wouldn't even necessarily say that that's entirely untrue. As a person who was very attracted to that sort of politics in my early 20s, as a kind of conservative anti-imperialist and a blue-collar person, I definitely see that. But the thing is I realized that I was
there's no denying that like there is a working class MAGA contingent.
Right. Some people do try to
no denying
it, but yeah, it would be bullshit. I think it's harder to deny now. People tried to in the first Trump administration. I think it's very hard to deny that now. And I think it's even hard to deny that at some level, it's even multiracial in a way that really disturbs liberals.
Right. Yeah, I think it still is like a racist movement, but they made it in a way where like, if you're brown, if you're black, if even if you're a Muslim, even like you can have a place within the movement. You just have to like stay within that place and not get too uppity or whatever, basically.
Right.
It's like you can be black, you just have to like hate BLM and like never actually side with black people when they like stand up for their rights,
Yeah, and I find this very let's say weird. But I also do get this response to the liberal co-opting of radical talking points. And so I do think if we look back to the Boulanger situation, we actually see something similar where there were liberal co-opting of possibilist and even Gadaist talking points at that time period, which made the Blanquist and the Gaday Boulanger splitters like Lafargue more popular. In fact, one of the things that Draper critiques Gaday on is not going harder on the opposition. Like, because he didn't go harder on the opposition, instead they tried to declare neutrality to Boulanger. It seemed like Lafargue flirting with it without fully going there was within the possibility of party doctrine. And Draper's like, it doesn't seem like Engels like that. We don't know what Marx would have thought because he was dead by this point. But I think it's interesting to look at some other things. You and I have both studied a whole lot of the Second International, and I didn't really realize how much that kind of thinking was popular in the Second International, because we tend to think of the socialist right in the Second International as Kautsky and Bernstein, but it wasn't. Yeah. They're the center until Lenin really moves the center. But the socialist right was like Ebert, and then people like Windermere and stuff arguing that like German imperialism would be good for socialism. Like that was a real argument had in the Second International. It wasn't the dominant position, but it was a serious position on the right wing of the SPD, and in the Second International, which led to some of the stuff that led up to the situation in World War I. And so I do think we can see this coming back over and over again. And so, like, because, we don't just have to jump from Boulanger to 2013. We can see this there. I think we see it with also, certain kinds of supporting of like Bothism or whatever. Although I will say that it is slightly different from a Marxist perspective to encourage nationalism in an imperialized country than it is to encourage nationalism in a core country. And that distinction also seems to be dropped by all these people.
Right. I mean, and I think with I would say even ill in like a imperialized country, supporting nationalism should always be seen as like a tactical thing, and should always like remain like critical of nationalism even in the third world. So I think that's one thing I will add. But no, you're absolutely right. And I think one thing I will another kind of thing I will point to is the Sorelians and the kind of weird national syndicalists that arise in the Second International. A lot of that crowd were very much in line with Bernstein's critiques of Orthodox Marxism, actually. They just kind of drew different political conclusions from those critiques, but they actually did converge with the kind of revisionist rejection of Orthodox Marxism in a lot of ways.
Well, yes, Sorel was a revisionist in the Bernsteinian sense, actually, but instead of being a bland cosmopolitan, he decided to be a mythic anti-Semite. Endorse Lenin, and also, I mean, we do Sorel's one of his last things is to kind of endorse Mussolini. So it's not people like, oh, Sorel never went there. I'm like, no, he did. He died shortly thereafter, but he went there. We also saw this in a lot of the former SPD Italian socialists like Robert Michel's becoming Mussolini supporters. The left flank of the fascist was, and I think Zeev Sternhall makes this pretty clear and also talks about this later on in an Israeli context, but he definitely spells it out in a European context, that the left flank of the of fascism was pretty much the same people who were the right flank of social democracy. Like, there's a strong overlap.
Right, but it's interesting though, because some of them are kind of on the left wing of the party. For example,
there's also
like Mussolini, for example, he's like a very much a kind of like crypto syndicalist, almost crypto anarchist, like far left of the party, but embraces national chauvinism because he kind of sees national chauvinism as this way to mobilize people and break apart the kind of to break apart the kind of parliamentary stupor of bourgeois society is kind of the way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I would actually, I find this actually an important point, because one thing that you see weirdly, and I don't want to say that the center is always right, but like the left communists produce, particularly their Bordigist branch, but also some other kinds like left oppositionists, socialism or barbarism, a lot of people who join up with the right flank of social democracy eventually. Mussolini's a prime example, because he's the left flank of the maximalist faction of the Socialist Party, which is the left-wing faction. He's to the left of them. He's almost a syndicalist. Sometimes he even sounds like he agrees with Bordiga and the early communist. But something happens in World War I, and he basically initially adopts an accelerationist position that we need to go into the war to destroy the Italian state. And then in the middle of the war flips and decides, no, the war is good and we need this kind of left imperialism. And then he just drops the left part. So there is this sort of like ultra left, right deviationist, weird hybrid mesh that happens. The French negationists all came out of like situationists, Bordigists, etc.
The first like, kind of weird Holocaust deniers.
Yeah, the Holocaust.
It's funny how it wasn't like at all related to anti-Zionism, really, like why they became Holocaust deniers.
No, it was anti-popular frontism.
Yeah.
It was. I'm so mad at the Popular Front that the one thing that made it look justifiable, which is the show and the Holocaust, we must deny. because we can't justify that there would ever have been any reason to take it seriously.
That whole saga is absolutely fascinating. Not gonna lie to me, so it's kind of disturbing. But I mean, and I don't want to fall into the trap of kind of like Alexander V. Ross thought, where like there's always this thread of the Red-Brown Alliance, and we need to like constantly be like policing the left and like canceling people who we might see as like potentially like suspect of this like type of thought,
and working with the feds.
That's not the argument we're trying to make here. I think the argument that what Engels ends up kind of saying as an alternative to both Lafargue and people even to his right and the populist is essentially, he starts from the basic position of we're opposed to both parties. We're for class independence, and that is Gesde's position as well. But he kind of differentiates from Gesde's position, because Gesde's position is kind of like, this is just infighting between two camps of capitalists that we have no real truck with, and it's just not our concern, essentially. And Engels is kind of like, and then I think Draper kind of makes a point that like this kind of lets Gesde tolerate the people who do want to support Boulanger within his camp.
Mm-hmm.
Also like maintaining unity with the people who obviously like don't want to take that position. So taking this position, like, this is just like bourgeois infighting. This isn't like our concern. In the end, like regardless of who rules, the working class will be exploited. And Engels says, no, this, it might sound similar to the correct kind of class independent position, but it assumes like apathy towards questions of the form of state and the form of republic and democracy, essentially. It's like we are not apathetic to the kind of democratic rights that the working class has. And we do need to fight for our democratic rights, but we need to do so from an independent perspective.
Right.
Means not forming electoral alliances with the radicals, but running our own opposition party. And I think Lafargue answers Engels by saying, "Oh, we did try this, but it didn't work." And I think it's funny is like Draper adds, like, the example that Lafargue gives is they like did this kind of like jokey like campaign where they like nominated Boulanger's horse for president or something like that. Like, and it's like, no, that wasn't the serious like attempt to actually do independent class politics. That was, that's not what, And so, and I think, obviously it's easier said than done to actually do what Engels is advocating. But I think Engels does kind of make the point that, like, listen, you guys didn't actually try to do a truly independent position of proletarian struggle for democracy. You're simply throwing up your hands and saying that the struggle is irrelevant to you. But it is possible to fight against the reactionary right and fight against these attacks on democratic institutions to the extent they exist without forming without sacrificing your independent position.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I'm a big advocate for, it's actually one of the things that we might debate between ourselves is how extensively we should be separated from the Democrats, whereas I tend to have a very hard line and you have a hard line for the DSA.
Relative to DSA,
right, yeah. But I would say where we both agree is independent socialist politics is both that, but it's also not running an impossible third party campaign for an executive office first. Like, this is where you and I both agree, because we're just like I don't have a problem with Jill Stein. If people want to vote for Jill Stein because it expresses their conscience, go ahead. But there's no statistical way that Jill Stein wins the presidency. There's no statistical way that the PSL wins the presidency. And there doesn't seem to be that much effect of these third party things on, say, I don't know, shifting the Democratic Party, making a faction within the Democratic Party feel like they can split from the Democratic Party. Like, if anything, there's this weird paradox today where I think something like 70% of the population believes we need third-party representation and more, better representation in politics. But also, fewer and fewer people are willing to vote for it because all the third parties are jokes.
Right. I would just add, I guess, one thing you could kind of raise to Engels is being like, well, Engels, like obviously in a parliamentary context in 19th century France, this is a viable strategy of, forming an independent opposition and fighting for democracy without, aligning with either, camp or whatever. But, in the U.S., that's just not possible because we have a two-party system. And so in the end, we have, it just doesn't work. The strategy just doesn't work in the U.S. Like, so you have to, figure this out. It's like, well, yes, something like you just pointed out, kind of why, there is a truth to that, but, you still have to work to build something independent. Like personally, I voted for PSL, which is, I'm not the biggest fan of that organization. I can have some pretty harsh criticisms of PSL, but
me and you actually
the last moment I decided it was either PSL or Jill Stein. I think I went with PSL because
I went with PSL because no one could say I wouldn't vote for a woman of color, as opposed to Jill Stein. And also, like, I think even though I don't love the PSL, I was like, I think their positions are maybe sort of closer to mine, at least on Palestine. Although I didn't hate the Green Party this time either. I thought the vice presidential candidate was actually somewhat impressive, but I also know math, and I was like, okay, even if the Green Party won every single Muslim vote in the United States, they would only be halfway through their 5% threshold. And I'm just like, so I don't really know what they're actually advocating for here. And I do know what the PSL is advocating for. So
the challenges of building a third party in the US are just so massive. And I mean, it's something that I've obsessed over for years of my life. I've written about party building. I'm part of a pro-party building caucus in DSA, and I try to contribute to that as much as I can, so. But lately, man, I'm just, it is kind of, I have to admit I am a bit demoralized lately. I mean, possibly in a time where that demoralization is probably more dangerous than ever. But like, it's just the odds seem so insurmountable. But if you think about it, this is the kind of time period where, a new party might become viable. So
well, I mean, I think we can just honestly say no one gives a shit about the Constitution anymore, and they're not even pretending to. Like,
right.
So in some ways, it's like, well, if we're at that point, maybe it is easier. But I don't know, because it's also easier to suppress us. And one of the things that I talk about is like getting rid of the bourgeois rights we do have actually opens us up as targets relatively easily.
Yes.
And
that is the biggest concern is, losing freedom of speech, losing, right to a fair trial, things like that,
Yeah. And this expansion of emergency powers, which I will say is not unique to Trump. One of the things that worries me is, and something that the broad left, whatever the fuck that is, has to like reconcile with, is not holding the Obama administration accountable for not rolling back the War on Terror Accords, which really did do a damage to bourgeois proceduralism in a major way that, unfortunately, since only libertarians seem to care about, fell out of the conversation on the left as soon as Obama came to office, and then it was associated with obnoxious libertarians, like, and people like Alex Jones, who may or may not be acting in good faith anyway.
Right.
So we never held there was no real like calling Obama out, really. There are a few people, I don't want to say nobody did, but for not undoing the War on Terror Accords and the Patriot Act and all that. And now today, what we see is like emergency powers can be utilized to do pretty much whatever. And I do think, for me, this means we are like, the imperial presidency is a thing that goes back to at least Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, but definitely accelerates after FDR. It gets institutionalized under Eisenhower, and we've seen it grow until Nixon. There's a pushback under Nixon that's successful. The Impoundment Acts, the Church Commissions, all those things, and in addition to impeaching Nixon. Then it gets amped up again under Reagan, so it doesn't stay down very long. And you see it get pushed back against in the Clinton administration by the right, actually. And then once Bush comes to power, pretty much there's no pushback from any major force in American life. I mean, like I said, the libertarians kind of care until they all gave up and became nationalists, except for like 5 of them.
Yeah. Say the libertarians have all decided that crypto scams are more important than civil liberties.
Right. But I mean, it is interesting because one of the things you can look at in this coalition, and for people who think, for some people like, oh, Varn's coming down on Trump, he must forgiven the Democrats. No, The Economist, I think, said that Biden was Trumpism with a human face, and I think that's actually true. And what makes the current Trump so difficult to deal with is not only does that mean that it's hard to argue that the Democratic opposition was all that serious, but it also means that Trump can now pivot to the right of himself because he can pretend he's pivoting to the right of Biden. And we are seeing that over and over. We're seeing him reverse policies that he actually started, that the Biden administration rationalized and humanized. And now we're seeing, being totally jettisoned by Trump without dealing with the fact Trump's where they came from.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting situation. And I will admit that I was wrong. And I thought that this would be a fairly normal, still very bad and something you should oppose, but relatively normal right-wing presidency because of the bourgeois limitations on Trump's power. And with the tech oligarchs switching sides, that doesn't seem to be the case. There is no longer a bourgeois limitation.
I think when I started really worrying about Trump was when Peter Thiel kind of started getting involved in this, and when Elon started getting involved in this. It was really like, at a certain point, like, is Elon running for president? Like, what's going on here? Like, Elon really seems to like be the center of the Trump campaign. And, I had a good friend, we were talking one day and he was just like, man, I just don't think Trump can win with this Elon guy. Like, it's just like, who's going to vote for this? Like, who likes Elon this much? Like, all Trump does is like talk about Elon and show off Elon at his rallies and push the, like everyone hate Elon's cringe. No one's gonna vote for this. And it's like, I wouldn't be so sure. And if he does win, it's gonna be bad. Like, it's gonna be bad. I always, I didn't, vote against. I didn't vote for Kamala, but I was worried about Trump winning, to be honest. And
yeah, well, it puts people like you and I in a real hard situation because I think there's no way I could endorse the failure of the Democrats.
Exactly.
And I want to be very clear on that, but I can't endorse that. I also don't really have a viable third option, but I refuse to be like, okay, well, somehow we're going to pivot this in some 40-dimensional chess way to be good for us. Because that's what I hear is like, oh, this creates opportunities for us. And I'm like, anything can create opportunities for us.
Yeah.
The answer is, what are we going to do with them, and what's the likelihood that we do anything with them? And I'm not seeing a lot of, like, the left response to Trump seems to be demoralization and also like, what do we do now that we can't rely on 50,000 people for a meaningless protest? Like, because the other thing that it's made clear is a lot of the habitus of the left from the 60s to about 5 years ago, they're exhausted. They don't really work. And I mean, and in that sense, we are in a similar thing to like the late 19th century, in that both the liberals and what we would now call the left were in embryonic form in the beginning of that, but they went through like 2 empires and 3 republics in France and like multiple situations in England, different relationships to whether or not they were going to how they were going to deal with the Liberal Party. The Labor Party wasn't even completely in existence yet, and also the United States at that time, even though Ingalls was apt in pointing out that the land situation and the currency speculation situation meant that we really didn't have a left, he also thought we were still probably to the left of anything in Europe, which I think actually in that time period he was probably correct about. So it is we're now in a situation where no one would argue that we're to the left of Europe. Europe was also increasingly less relevant. The European left is not in any better shape than the American left. In fact, it seems like it might be in worse shape,
yeah.
which is kind of hard to imagine. Like, it's like, how did you guys fuck up so bad that you went from like, we talk about America not having a real left where there is a left in Europe to being like, Europe might be in a worse situation than us. Even places with relatively strong left. I've been following France Unbowed, and they were like, even a few months ago, the Front Populaire was like really dominant, and their popularity has plummeted since Macron hasn't gone away.
Yeah.
And it's really looking like, barring a miracle, that like we might be looking at Le Pen the next formal election, and I have no idea what that means for the EU. We're also seeing the Christian Democratic Union in Germany. It looks like they're going to come back to power, and they're going to shut out the AfD, which is now a much bigger player. But they're also going to co-opt the AfD's policies,
Right?
Like, so not a big difference there either. If it'd be like if we had a MAGA movement separate from the Republican movement. The Republican movement's like, we must suppress the MAGA movement, but also we should adopt half their policies anyway. It would be pretty much where we are in Europe. And so I don't want to have people to be hopeless, but I also think Ingalls is right that trying to like play off a figure like this is dumb, because you have to take responsibility for what they do. And in the case of General Boulanger, it ended up no one had to deal with it because he blew his own head off.
Yes, exactly. He commits suicide. He well, they tried to get him to do a coup, but he decides not to do it, basically.
Right.
And then I think he ends up just kind of falling into like irrelevancy and suiciding pretty quickly after that.
Right. Which ends up like settling the situation, but the idea keeps on copping back up. And I'm just like, well, I think we have to admit how hard it is what we're demanding, because I'm with you. I think a third party in the United States would actually require a significant rethinking of constitutional level election laws. And that's going to be hard to do. We do have a history of it in the United States. Ross Perot's the most recent, which was a real threat. But also, like, there's 1919 when both the Socialist Party and the Bull Moose Party were like breaking 5% of the vote. Like, in fact, I think the Bull Moose Party broke like 20% of the vote,
Yeah,
and the Socialists were huge. So
yeah, I think the collapse of the Whigs is really the biggest thing to be looking at. I think right now, if there is a silver lining, if there is an opportunity, it's basically that the Democratic Party collapses and some kind of left-wing party can, kind of start consolidating out of that.
Well, here's a question. Do we see the possibility of a center liberal Bonapartist figure emerging? Because one of the things that we didn't, like, if you were to look at the post George W. Bush Republican Party, we thought they were pretty much dead in the water and in civil war. And one of the things I'll say about the right is, if Trump is not there, the right is at civil war with itself. Trump is a figure whose like demagogic personhood is literally stopping like Bannon and Elon Musk from like taking each other out.
I know.
And, like, I can't imagine. The thing is, Obama was kind of the loser, lame duck version of that. I And I say loser lame duck not because Obama was actually a lame duck, it's because he lame ducked himself. He did not use his popularity for whatever reason.
He could have been the savior of American liberalism, you know, like that was kind of that was really the hope, you know, that this was our, you know, the American liberal dream was going to be saved, and Obama was going to be its champion, and he was going to resolve the contradictions and reestablish you know, American greatness, you know.
I mean, it's funny because we talk about the current realignment, but I try to like point people to the fact that we've kind of been in electoral chaos since the 70s, and what really distorts that is the strength of the Reagan response, which seemed like which was a bigger realignment than even Trump, if we're quite honest. Reagan only had like a couple of percentage points more on his win, but like when you win the electoral college vote and you control like what I think in the second term he controls like 49 out of 50 states as far as like where they go in the electoral college. Like we can't even imagine that now. There's literally nobody in American life that I would like think could do that. But Reagan, while he did a lot of damage to norms and whatnot, he didn't really do that much damage to the Democratic Constitution and the norms, but small d there. And the norms that emerged under him were mostly actually to preserve it in some ways. What we learned from Trump is that they were just norms. Like, there was no enforcement of any of this. It was like norms and Supreme Court decisions, many of which weren't even that left wing. Like people were going about Chevron deference, and Chevron deference isn't even a left wing ruling.
Yeah.
But it does seem worrying to me that liberals literally don't seem to be able to imagine a political response that is not just relying more and more on the administrative state.
Right, exactly. That's the thing, is they've relied so much on constitutional legalism as their means of like protecting whatever democratic freedoms we do have from Trump, that you know, they've essentially left themselves powerless to actually do anything when, you know, Trump actually realizes, wait a second, like if I get enough tech oligarchs on my side and you know, actually go for some kind of essentially a coup after getting elected. It's interesting how it's kind of like he gets elected into power, but at the same time, like there is kind of like this Elon coup happening where he's taking over the, you know, the payment processing system of the entire federal government. But at the same time, it's like the liberals are like, you can't do that. That's not constitutional. But it's like, well, actually, like, is there anything in the Constitution that says you can't do this? Like,
well, the thing is, there was, and they've kind of fucked it up. I mean, one of the things is like even cabinet positions were originally supposed to be appointed by Congress, but Congress abrogated that in the early 20th century.
Right.
So, like, when you actually look at this, liberals have been throwing their stuff behind the administrative state, mostly, honestly, not even because they believed in the administrative state, but because they didn't want to take the electoral hit. Like, and this really, I think this really shows up when we get to the Warren Court, like even before Trump, like we have basically a breakdown of norms in the late 60s. And how do we get out of it? We're like, Supreme Court, fix it. And then we're like, no one really puts together on the left that the right could just, you know, do that. And honestly, the only reason it didn't happen sooner is you kept on having right-wing justice have pains of conscience and like moving away from the right wing. Like many of the quote liberal justices were appointed by Reagan or Nixon. So it's like, well, but by the grace of constitutionalism, go you, I guess. But that's over now. It's completely over. I mean, we're basically relying, and Trump knows this, on Amy Coney Barrett and Gorsuch to make the decisions because they're not particular. I mean, ironically, Trump's own appointees are not his most loyalist faction. But we have no idea what they're going to do. Like, I can't predict them. I really have a hard time predicting Gorsuch and Amy Coney Barrett. I have a little bit easier of a time of predicting John Roberts, but even there, it's not perfect. And then I'm like, and by the time it gets to that point, most of this is going to be long done. And one thing that does point out is that the Democrats' belief in proceduralism has meant that they didn't do stuff that they could have probably done.
Yeah. Honestly, I don't understand why they didn't just put Trump in jail and just like.
Why take the swing in the courts and then like not fast track it ever?
Right.
That was what I was amazed by. I'm like you're gonna like. They waited so long to do anything on these cases that basically the timer ran out on them.
Yeah.
And it was the same thing that you saw with the Obama administration's talk about the ACA, is they just kind of assumed that they were going to be in power forever. Like, it's just crazy to me. I mean, and you know, I'm not like, if you want to talk about delusional politicians, Biden thinking that he could have won this if they hadn't have like forced him out is one of the most delusional things I like have ever even contemplated in the history.
But Varn, there's one U.S. presidential candidate who has beaten Donald Trump in an election. That was Joe Biden. You know, so
yeah, not under weird, extraordinary circumstances. And also,
yeah, that's the thing is I mean, don't get me started on that. Like, just how disgusting that whole cover up was, and how people defended him for so long when it was just so blatant. And
yeah, I mean, it was something else. And I remember last year watching that stupid debate and going, you set up the debate, you set up the rules, and you can't even not sundown on camera despite all that.
Yeah, like his wife comes on, she's like, Joe, you did so good, you answered every question. It's like just answering the questions was an accomplishment for him, and they knew that, and they said it out loud, and they still thought everything was okay.
Yeah, but also, you know, the liberal talking points that, like, because I remember when Trump won, I saw the normal liberal talking points like they'd rather vote for no democracy than a black woman. I'm like, that's just not gonna fly, because also Lori excuse me, see, I screwed up and said Lori Lightfoot because that's what I'm thinking about, but Harris is a Lori Lightfoot figure. Like a police candidate that was never super popular in even her home state. She barely won AG even in a thoroughly blue region. She's also prone to screw ups, and it seemed very clear that the Democratic establishment knew that if they were going to get rid of Biden, they didn't want to have a contested legacy by getting rid of the Veep, but also they knew that she wouldn't be able to stand up in a primary. Like, yeah. I think they knew that. And so, you know, it's hard for me to think, like, if you guys took Trump, I mean, you know, this is where I'm going to come off on my big answer. If you guys were so afraid of Trump, then what you did as a ruling class doesn't really make a lot of sense. Like, you didn't seem to take it all
right. But what they did as a ruling class was really kind of a response to Bernie, if you think about it. Like, the kind of the Biden-Harris ticket was the ruling class's answer to the, I guess, you know, the kind of close. I guess, you know, because of the Bonapartism analogy, you know, you can kind of say, well, where's the working class revolt in this instance? Like, where's that place? Like, well, you could say, you know, in a weak kind of, you know, compromised form, it existed in the Bernie campaign in 2020 and in the George Floyd rebellion in 2020. You can say that it was kind of not a organized, coherent, you know, proletarian, you know, uprising. But, you know, you could kind of see the raw materials of which one, enough of which to kind of scare the ruling class into acting certain ways. And in this case, I think the Biden regime, like, I know that's the term that like all the MAGAs like to use for it, is the regime or the dissidents. But I guess that means that we're the dissidents now and they're the regime. But the kind of Biden regime was created as a Democratic Party like response to Bernie.
Right. And Bernie capitulated. And I do think we should be mad about that. I mean, one of the things that I was actually surprised at, I shouldn't have been, but I was how not so much the squad, but specifically Bernie and AOC like looked to be bending the knee at the wrong time over and over.
I know. Again. It's absolutely disgraceful.
You know, like, I mean, you know, you can give Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar credit for at least not doing that. I also think one of the things that we can say about the rest of the squad is that, and I don't say this as a criticism of the membership of the DSA, but the DSA electeds after that first round were not ready.
No.
Corey Bush and Jamal Bowman, yes, AIPAC had to throw stuff to destroy them, but I point out to people, AIPAC didn't try to destroy Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib because they know it wouldn't work. So, like, they picked the weak ones, and it was pretty clear that Bowman was weak. I mean, Bowman was turning on his own constituency towards the end there. And it was also clear that Corey Bush had pissed off labor in a big way. When you're a labor candidate, that's a dumb idea.
Yeah.
But this weird idea of like right laborism is crazy to me, because I'm in a state where we're about to lose collective bargaining rights for public sector workers. At least we've stalled it. We've kind of won day after day, but they keep on stalling it to put the vote out. So who knows? They're probably going to win it by the end of the legislative session. Luckily, in our state, that's only a month long, but we'll find out. But it seems to me, yeah, it seems to me, though, also looking at what the southern states are doing, even to private sector unions, and how hard they're making it to unionize in the South after there was one Amazon union victory, that this idea of like right-wing laborism is pretty bullshit unless you're a Teamster.
Yeah.
Like, that seems to be the only union that seems to maybe benefit from the current situation. And I want to remind people, this current Bonaparte does look to be killing, the possibility of, through court action, killing the NCLB entirely. Right. And thus putting us back at pre-New Deal rules, which I would also say, as a person who doesn't like the NCLB, if you guys were prepared, if the unions have been preparing for it for a decade, then maybe this wouldn't be a bad thing, but they haven't been. They're totally going to be.
Maybe they could turn like a more independent, more anti-state unionism, but no, that's not the direction they've been heading. And the Sohrab Ahmari types who like want a kind of like New Deal corporatism, but with like MAGA cultural policies, they're not going to get what they want. They're not going to be happy. Like all they're going to do is just be like useful idiots for, the oligarchs in this case. But the big old J.D. Vance said in an interview that he supports like sectoral bargaining. I was like, well, you know what? Like that's not, you're not going to get this kind of like corporatist, like, situation, like kind of like, that's not what's going to happen. I mean, I think we both know that.
Yeah, not with Elon Musk and the tech oligarchs, because the one thing the tech oligarchs have successfully done is made sure otherwise high-powered workers until relatively recently, thank you AI, didn't unionize, for exactly the things that we're seeing now, because the tech workers have not even had what like the entertainment workers had to push back on overuse and abuse of AI. And we're also seeing that in education. I mean, we just saw the Cal University system say they're going to be the first integrated public-private AI university system, and I'm like, oh my fucking god! So if people think we're super sanguine on the Democrats, we're not, and I'm just saying, like, now is the time for the stakes of the independence of the left to be clear. But the thing is, I want to say, at least if we're following Marx and Engels, independence does not mean tailing the right to get away from liberals either. That is still tailing. It is still tacit Bonapartism. It is still,
and it doesn't mean being apathetic about the state of the institutions in your country either.
Yeah, there's some. I get some left communists who are still fans of me on Twitter who are always like, well, nothing's changed at all. And I'm like,
right.
I mean, what is your criterion for change? And I have to remember that apparently, like, the only thing that meets that criterion for non-standard bourgeois politics for them is the word literally exploding. But like,
well, just look at what Engels says to Lafargue. He's like, oh, so you think that, this is just an infighting between two camps of the bourgeoisie that has no real meaning. Well, do you think that, like, for the German Social Democrats, that whether or not, like, their party press is illegal has no real meaning whatsoever to them, that it's merely just a a kind of formal judicial like detail that has no like connection to reality? Like, do you think that that's like not an issue to them that they care about? Like,
yeah, I mean, it's funny because we do hear these things, like even the explicit suppression of the left, not just of liberals, but of the left, is like, well, but it doesn't really matter. And I'm like, this is literally like arguing that the Red Scare didn't like kill the CPUSA. Like it was like, but actually, by you guys' argument, the CPUSA should have emerged stronger than they were in 1948,
right
after the Red Scare. What do you want?
Like, the true face of the bourgeois state has been revealed. People have seen the true dictatorship of the bourgeoisie in action, but the reality was, it was just like anti-communism had a popular base in America. They were able to kind of use white chauvinism and just general nationalism to get people on board with anti-communism, as well as appealing to liberal democratic sentiments as well, to get people on board with anti-communism while undermining those exact liberal rights at home.
This is one thing I think that we both might agree with Danny Besner on, and I know you probably don't agree with Danny on a lot, but that
I wouldn't know because he blocked me for some reason on Twitter.
Oh, funny.
Daniel Besner, if you're listening, please unblock me.
That's actually funny. Yeah. One thing I would say that I do agree with him on is that Cold War liberalism is the dominant rhetorical tactic of the Democrats, to a point that it's actually made it difficult to deal with the current situation. And I'll give you the example that all that anti-Russia shit, and I'm not saying Russia didn't do anything between 2015 and 2019. Like, I do think they did some stuff. I just don't think it mattered.
Yeah, exactly. Not as much as what Israel did. And
right. Like, Israel or Europe or even Britain.
And they just did what any government would have done under those circumstances. Like, every government has intelligence agencies that use soft power to try like influence things to their advantage.
Right. Like, the reason why we focus on this on the Russians is, I think, twofold. One is theirs is actually kind of crude compared to a lot of other groups, and two, I saw these weird resurrections on the liberal side of the aisle of like anti-Soviet stuff during the first Trump administration. That's like pretending that like Trump was like somehow a manifestation of communism or a secret Marxist Leninist. And I'm like, that's bizarre, but it does seem to be a legacy of Cold War liberalism, also in the sense that they don't recognize any difference between fascism and communism at all. Even if you think like certain communist regimes are bad, I don't pretend that they're the same thing as a fascist regime.
Right.
I mean, even though, with maybe the exception of the Khmer Rouge, I don't.
Yeah, I was gonna say Khmer Rouge, or well, even like what kind of trad communist guys like Ceausescu, it's not exactly fascism. It's it's bad. But it's not exactly fascism.
Yeah, Ceausescu, the worst elements of Hoja when he banned beards or whatever. Yeah. But in general, they're not exactly fascist. Which also, if fascism wasn't the only thing we thought was bad,
right.
I do have my theory about the reason why we go to the F word so much is that it's the one time where radical liberals, anarchists, bourgeois nationalists, even in the center, and communists were all on the same side for about 2 years.
Right.
Which means everyone except for fascists can claim it as a heroic narrative, which is why we invoke it so much.
Right. I mean, everybody hates fascists. Everybody knows that that a fascist is not like. I mean, but that's kind of changing. I think more and more people like on the right are like not really so scared of fascism anymore.
Have you read the Paul Gottfried book on fascism?
Not yet.
I suggest you do, because one of the things that he does is like, basically, fascism was bad, but it wasn't that. It was no worse than Stalinism. Hitlerism was really bad, but fascism maybe was redeemable if it hadn't got so messed up in Hitlerism.
Right. Yeah, that seems to be a common thing I actually hear a lot, is like people kind of defending Mussolini. But, well, really the problem with Mussolini is that he teamed up with Hitler. But if you look up until then, Mussolini wasn't really that bad. He kind of just kept the communists at bay, which is kind of what we need now with wokeness.
Right. And you also see that with people like I was watching a video on Tolkien, because I'm that kind of nerd. And Tolkien is pretty good on race, was not necessarily, I mean, not great, but like he, for example, opposed apartheid. So when I say pretty good, for a conservative Catholic, he was pretty good on race.
Yeah.
But he was a Phalange supporter. And I was surprised when that was talked about on a video, how many right-wingers were openly like, well, we're not Nazis, but the Phalange was cool.
Yeah.
Like, oh boy, like we are now in, and you know, not Hitler, but Mussolini and Franco, they're okay. And I'm like, we're there? Wow, we're further down this pipeline than I thought.
Yeah, and it's like, the problem with Hitler is that he went after Jews, who are actually a high IQ people who can,
gone after some low IQ plebs, like just the Roma or something, that it would have been okay. I'm like,
right. That's kind of the argument they make, to be honest. Like, it seems like increasingly, like the far right is like seeing like anti-Semitism almost as like, oh, that's like a pleb, like low IQ, like mentality, like a true like right wing Chad like wants to get the Jews on their side because the Jews have high IQs, and they're based like in Israel,
Yeah, but this is interesting. Actually, I was gonna, like, since we can kind of close this part and talk about the right currently. I find it interesting that the liberals responded to the easily defeated parts of the quote alt-right, which is like alt-right white nationalism. That's actually mainly what but they underestimated the neo-reactionary alt-right. And they underestimated two ways. One, it flattered tech oligarchs. So like they have money. Yarvin's like, I mean, the fact that Yarvin isn't laughed out of the room, but it gets like a sympathetic interview at the New York Times is actually telling that even for liberals, that was safe. Two, one of the reasons why it's safe is they're like, we're not white nationalists because we want to get rid of the low IQ Scotch Irish too. Like, it's like, oh, so you're actually not white nationalists for even more reactionary reasons.
Yes. Like, I remember reading like Curtis Yarvin back in like 2013, because I remember there were like a few kind of like articles going around, like kind of vaguely left media websites being like, there's this new kind of brewing weird fringe intellectual current, but they have friends of power in Silicon Valley, like Peter Thiel, and it's the Dark Enlightenment, and it's this guy Mencius Moldbug, and he's Curtis Yarvin, and he doesn't believe in the
like Nick Land spent a whole lot of time. Not Nick Land, excuse me. That's a fuck up. Mark Fisher, former Nick Land associate, spent a whole lot of time arguing with Moldbug. I think partly because Fisher was a former Nick Land associate and was trying to make it clear that he was distancing himself, which I also ironically think made why you and I were hearing about so much about neo-reaction in like 2012, 2013, because like Mark Fisher was arguing with them.
Right.
I remember reading Fang Numina before it had come out that Nick Land had turned right wing.
Right.
But although I'll be honest with you, if you read Fang Numina, by the last 5 or 6 essays, if you don't know that guy's going to be right wing, even though he's like, oh, there's a difference between me and then, I'm like, no, there's a pretty big continuity actually.
Yeah.
But they're the people who won. Like like Richard Spencer just became a racist Bidenist.
Yeah.
Like,
Richard Spencer's hilarious now. He's just like going after MAGA guys, just like calling them like stupid, like.
Yeah, I mean, it's fun watching him sometimes because I'm like, it's like the mirror world. Like, I'm like, this guy is attacking them, but he's also just a racist. But he's basically a liberal elitist racist.
Yeah.
I also remember some of the softer versions of that. Some of the like left nationalist people getting on the Biden train for a while. Like Angela Nagel was a Bidenist for a while. I don't know if she stayed one, but she was for the first 2 or 3 years. And I find this all very worrying because I'm like, the neo-reaction is actually more reactionary, but unlike white nationalism, has some appeal to elites. And one of the things I will also say is we're in a weird situation, like the way we were with on the attacks of CRT at the beginning of the Biden administration. CRT is an objectively bad idea from my perspective. Like, if you see where Abraham X. Kendi ended up, where most of that stuff has ended up, even on its own, it wasn't ever a good thing. But we got backed into a corner by the right because they were using it to attack things that weren't CRT. So you either did the dumb thing that liberals did, was like, well, CRT is just anti-racism, which it isn't. Or you did the thing like, we have to defend CRT to defend anti-racism, or you are like me, like, we have to figure out a way to do this, but without condoning CRT, but that's really hard.
Yeah.
And I think that's happened with DEI now, because like, I do think there's some truth when people say DEI, they mean a lot more than DEI. Yeah. But I also think like we shouldn't be defending DEI.
The DEI programs are mostly just like, maybe not in all cases they were useless, but in most cases, probably 90%. It probably there probably were even some instances where it maybe even made things like worse by like making like white people like think about like whiteness too much, or I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's actually very cool in the case of academia, where like DEI has had an effect and most of it's been bad. But like the corporate stuff, it was like just people having to do mandatory trainings they resent.
Yeah, it was But yeah, it's clear that the reaction to it is like just an all-out like kind of racist, revanchist like attack on the legacy of the civil rights movement.
Yeah, I mean they're trying to. I mean, there is an element who's like, okay, well, the civil rights movement failed, let's completely undo it. And while that isn't that directly said, I think that the fact that Trump went back to undo executive orders going back all the way to 1965, actually, including things like the Equitable Employment Act, which just applied federal law to administrative hiring in the federal government.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's in the literature of the right at this point. They've had very like that book Age of Entitlement by Christopher Caldwell. That was like that book. I hear a lot of rightists talking about that book, and I've heard them talking about that book for a while. And that book is very much kind of makes a case against the Civil Rights Act as kind of like leading to like the current like malaise in the eyes of the right. So I think there definitely has been like. The right has definitely been gearing up to like kind of go after the Civil Rights Act. And I don't know how they're going to do it or what they're going to do, because I don't, how do you undo a constitutional amendment? Has that been done before? But
well, I mean, here's the thing. Ultimately, because I know neo-Confederate literature, being a Southerner and a former reactionary, I've been exposed to it. They want to undo the 13th and 14th Amendment.
Yeah,
that's really what they want to do. Going after birthright citizens is like a way to chip away at that. But if they would have their way, they do away with the 13th and 14th Amendment, which also I don't think people realize would mean that the Bill of Rights doesn't apply to the state legislatures at all. Like the Supremacy Clause doesn't expand the Bill of Rights to go to state governments, because people don't know this, but before the Civil War, you could have a state religion in a state and it was enforceable. It was only the federal government where it didn't apply. Or you could have what would be otherwise illegal laws about voting because the voting was a state right. And
right. That fits in with the whole patchwork idea that these Silicon Valley capitalists have.
Right. And so like there is a real sense that they don't just want to undo even the civil rights movement. They want to undo the effects of the Civil War.
Reconstruction,
right. They want to finish our botched second bourgeois revolution, and I specifically
and I think the going after the Civil Rights Act at this point, 10 years ago, that was like a radical far right position. Now it's a lot more acceptable in the right wing, and the real radical far right position is like going all the way back to pre-Civil War, where you have city states where you can just like import like slave labor from Dubai or something like that,
Right. I mean, here's what I think people should like be thinking about. Yeah, I do think we have to look at how far the right has gone. Like our own McIntyre, not related to the McIntyre I like, happens to have a very similar name. I think he wrote a very pernicious, but actually kind of smart, if pernicious.
I know who you're talking about, and I hate that guy, but
yeah,
you should pay attention to what people like him are saying.
Well, my point is, like, he has normalized neo-reactionary and Italian elite and even outright fascist ideas. Like, and he used to be just
crowd.
Yeah, he used to be just a standard Glenn Beck-esque neoconservative, and now he quotes a Vola in a book that has mainstream right appeal.
Yeah.
That is surprising. I'll also tell you something I told someone the other day, where people are like, why don't you go after more normal right-wingers more often? And you're right. And I'm like, I should. We should talk about Leo Strauss. We can talk. But I'm like, I'll be honest with you. Even though I think Ebola is a weird, crazy, esoteric crank, it used to be only weirdos who listened to like Feral House press stuff knew who he was, or if you were in the radical traditionalist movement, which was also basically a fascist movement, you knew who he was. Today, I see him cited on the conservative Wikipedia, not even on Conservapedia, on conservative Wikipedia in a way that would have never happened 10 years ago. So the right has moved pretty far right, and it's also abandoned its British/American heritage to a large degree. They're not citing Edmund Burke anymore. They're not citing even like Russell Kirk anymore. They're citing Carl Schmitt. They're citing Aaron McIntyre. They're citing Robert Michel. They're citing
And people like James Lindsay, like who try to kind of like keep that Anglo like tradition, that kind of like, you know, centrist liberal like Anglo kind of mindset alive against like wokeness or whatever. They're like totally shut out of the Trump administration, apparently.
And James Lindsay is also clearly going insane in response to that.
Yeah.
Like
you guys actually are becoming fascists.
Right. And I will be, you know, I know Sohrab Ahmari, he's been nice to me privately. I don't, you know, for a conservative, I don't hate the man at all. But even he seems to be like taken aback by where some of this was going. And then he felt heartened by the Trump administration's early, like, we're going to be a workerist, whatever. And I'm like, why would you believe that? I mean, one of the things about Trump is that it does illustrate something that's fascinating about Bonapartism, which is willing disbelief in the obvious by groups who benefit from the fact that they don't want to be the person who gets knifed last, but they know that somebody's probably going to.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing about Louis Bonaparte, is he turned on all the factions depending on where the wind blew. And that's another thing about Trump. He turns on all the factions depending on where the wind blew. In fact, if you're in the beginning of a Trump administration, I'm like, there's like 2% chance you're going to be standing by the end.
But I wonder, I wonder if he's going to can Elon or not. I wonder if maybe it'll be different this time, and that maybe some of these people are going to like stick around, and that it's like he has a plan this time.
I have no idea. I think
there's really no way we can know, because we don't really know the inner communications of these people, but it is something I've been thinking. It's like, maybe he's not just going to like do what he did last time and cycle through all these people. Maybe he really does have like a kind of plan with Elon to like stick it through and really like create a new regime together.
Well, here's one thing I can tell you that I'm seeing right now is Elon does the unpopular work, and even his popularity on the right is declining. But that means that Trump can stay right where he is, let Elon do it. And you know who takes the blame? Elon.
Yeah, no, that's what I've seen a lot of people say that, but so
that doesn't mean he's gonna try. Doesn't mean he's gonna turn over him. In fact, that might be a reason to keep him around, because
exactly.
Because you just be like, well, I mean, but I don't know. I mean, but one of the things I'll tell you about following Republican Party politics for as long as I have is like, very rarely do factions get not betrayed. I mean, I even think about the the George W. Bush administration, how many factions like came in and got screwed later on by the shifting winds, like as Karl Rove, and Dick Cheney lost a little bit of power in the last half of the second term. So many appointees got turned on, and this and the other. So, one of the weird things I've always found about Democrats is they tend to be institutional loyalists to a fucking fault. But with Trump, I don't know. And I think you and I have to be right. There's a real possibility Elon doesn't go away. And when I point this out to people, I'm like, oh, well, Bannon, I'm like, we've already seen Trump sideline Bannon multiple times. Like, he got sidelined in the first 2 years of the first Trump administration. Like,
yeah,
he went from, oh my God, secret president Bannon to nobody, which and then somehow came back, which means that I just don't know where any of this leads.
Have you read the Benjamin Teitelbaum book? Like, I think it's the War for Eternity or something like that. It's about it's worth reading if you haven't. Yeah.
It seems like a good it seems like the Teitelbaum book seems like a good pickup on the Mark Sedgwick work on the radical traditionalist movement and the emergence of the new right, new right. And Teitelbaum actually seems to go into the details a lot more because Sedgwick was writing about
he goes into Bannon's attempt to win Dugin over to an anti-China position, which is really interesting.
Which seemed to have worked, which is bizarre.
Which also didn't work according to the book, and Bannon felt betrayed by Dugin for because Bannon had this thing where China was kind of the ultimate mercantile power. It's it goes into Bannon's whole philosophy and how Bannon kind of created a version of Evolian traditionalism that could somehow work with the American petite bourgeois, because there is a kind of a contradiction between Evola's hostility to commercialism and the kind of yeoman independent small producer mentality of the American conservative, So it kind of goes into how Bannon kind of tried to make his own version of a kind of traditionalist doctrine for America that would be kind of pro populist but also elitist at the same time. But yeah, it's an interesting book. I think it does come off as Bannon is kind of an independent actor with his own ambitions, who tries to get what he can out of powerful people until he runs up against those limitations.
Bannon is a serious right-wing thinker, whereas Trump is a demagogue.
Yeah.
I'm not saying Trump is unintelligent, because that man has a reptile brain intelligence, the likes of which I think we've actually rarely seen.
Yes.
But
he's not an ideologue like Bannon. He doesn't have this worked out philosophy of traditionalist American conservative populism.
Right. In fact, he wouldn't work if he did. He would not work as a demagogic figure if he actually had a clear ideology in the way that George W. Bush did. But yeah, I mean, I think it leaves us in an interesting place. And I was talking to Sean of Antifada, and he's like, well, we shouldn't count the Democrats out, we didn't count the Republicans out. And I'm like, maybe we shouldn't. But here's the thing. The Republicans were mad at the Bush administration at the end of that term. But it does feel like even normie liberals are in some sense mad at the Biden administration for what happened.
Yeah, there's a lot of anger from normie liberals.
Even though they'll try to put up the defense, and even though sometimes they'll even try to blame third parties, they all kind of really know that their guy blew it.
Yeah.
And so it's and he blew it in a way that was if Trump wasn't the opposition, it would have been so glaringly fucking obvious that these people were incompetent. So it's just wild. And it does seem like just being able to go Trump bad. Well, you can't do that anymore. We got him back. It's not that's not going to work as an argument. And they seem totally lost. I when Trump started doing crazy stuff with the federal workforce, what did they go out and do? They're like, well, he's defunding the police.
The responses have been to like boycott Target for abandoning DEI policies and shop at Costco because they're maintaining DEI policies, and wear a mask to show that you're in solidarity with disabled people. And it's just the liberals have nothing. They have nothing.
Yeah,
and
I
so
know.
and that gives a huge opportunity for the left. I hope we don't squander it. We probably will. Maybe we won't. I don't know. But
I feel like too many of us are wedded to tailism in various varieties. And I think it shows up in this right-wing tailist we've been kind of critiquing with a discussion of the Bonapartists. But I think we also have to admit that, like, God, I don't mean to call someone out in your group out, but I was reading Groundwork. They seem to have gone from staffers to Italian futurists in like a day. So, like,
oh yeah, you're talking about the crisis organizing thing.
Yeah, I was like,
oh my god, that's the funniest stuff ever. Like, I couldn't believe that. It's like Move Fast and Break Things, like Sorelian, like.
Yeah, it's Move Fast and Break Things, the liberal edition. While we're living through the right doing that.
I know. It's just like, stop thinking and act. We need to act now.
Just
like, no, we need to think before we act. Yeah, that's really the takeaway I want from this. Just think a little bit before you act. Like,
yeah, we're not saying this in like the Zizek way where everything's always thinking and you never act ever.
Yeah, no, like, go to the protest. Like, do what you can to. We shouldn't like abstain from protest and actions against this administration at all. I think we need to be out there and we need to be. Fighting alongside normie liberals without surrendering our own politics,
Yeah.
But
yeah.
And it's the devil's in the details about how you actually do that in practice. So I think in the next 4 years, if we have another election, we'll see. It'll be an interesting exercise in actually taking up the advice that Engels gives to Lafargue.
Yeah. I think the question is, like, we've been burnt by the Popular Front because the Popular Front really has been used by liberals to make sure we don't ever betray them. Made us captured.
Yep. They essentially gave them veto power over us.
Right. And I think that really showed up particularly strongly in the Palestine situation. And now we have, and in a way that it's even made like Sam Cedar critical of the center of the Democratic Party, which is crazy. Like, at the same time, I do wonder, like, how do you form a united front when you're also insisting that we are actually anti-systemic? Because one of the things I think that rightly has been criticized by the left is we've looked to be afraid of the demolishment of the status quo.
Right, exactly. We've basically Biden was able to kind of co-opt like the left that came out of Bernie and make it look like a pro-system force, basically. And so therefore Trump and MAGA were able to like take up the anti-system energy and demolish the left with it.
And to be fair, it doesn't just seem to have been, like, I want to say strategically, this is not an American exceptional problem.
No, not at all.
This with Theresa and Podemos and the left populist in general. When push came to shove, in almost all instances, even when they came in on very anti-center liberal or center socialist platforms, they all capitulated at a bad moment in almost every one of those situations. The exception is France, and I kind of think it's because they haven't had the opportunity to. Yeah. I hope I'm wrong about that. I know I have some friends who are big France Unbowed fans who will yell at me, but like, I do sort of think like, well, Mélenchon has stood his ground, but no one else has.
Yeah, like, I think Mélenchon, like, I quite like Mélenchon. Like, he seems to have a bit more of a spine than a lot of these like other left-wing leaders. So yeah, credit to him for not completely caving yet.
I also think ultimately Corbyn ended up in having a spine, but he misgauged. I don't think he could figure out how to handle Brexit.
Yeah, that was.
Yeah, that's a huge one. And the other thing that he misgauged was his own goddamn party.
Yeah.
I would also say I don't think his actual plan would have worked in England because it seemed to be wanting your imperial industrial core without having an imperial industrial core anymore. But but you know, we didn't get that far. Like there is a possible thing for like at least swinging big. Maybe he would have done something. I don't know. But I do find it weird. And when people are like Lula, and I'm like, Lula is more progressive than a lot of more progressive in a left wing sense than a lot of other candidates, and he's sincerely popular. He's a once in a generation politician, but like the Workers' Party in Brazil has kind of sucked.
Yeah, so, no, I mean it's a very difficult situation there right now as well, where the left is increasingly being seen as the face of the system, and all anti-systemic energy is going to the right, and the left doesn't really know what to do.
Yep, and it's like it's actually weirdly kind of where they ended up during the the Rousseff period too, and it's just like, so it also does seem, and there's also the pink wave countries are not as copacetic with them. I mean, the tensions between Venezuela and Brazil are well known. The tensions between Guyana, which is a relatively left wing country, and Venezuela are well known.
Oh yeah.
But like. Malay is weirdly still popular in Argentina, despite the fact that he
turned the economy into a clown show.
Yeah, I mean, but he has cut inflation, which seems to have made him pop. I mean, that's the one thing I will say about Trump that's interesting to me is, I mean, he seems to be the tariff guy. He has always kind of been the tariff guy. He's already backed off this round of tariffs, though, after threatening them. But I'm like, what are you going to do? Because if he doesn't control inflation, he will lose the part of his base, which is not MAGA. And we have to admit that Trump won popularly. MAGA as a movement is not a popular movement as a whole. I mean, it's a mass movement, but it does not have majority support or even plurality support.
Yeah.
So
MAGA was able to come into power because you had a bunch of non-MAGA people who were just voting against the incumbent for economic reasons.
Right. Which we can deal with Democrats being like, oh, they're racist. I'm like, yeah, but that maybe that's why the MAGA core is there, but that's not why they won.
Right.
Looking at this now, I just don't know where you go with this exactly, but I do think it's interesting what's going to happen with. I mean, there are some things where the liberals have some actual good talking points that they're not seeming to capitulate on, which is like, you were mad about the Clinton emails. Okay, and I'm also I actually do think there was something to the Clinton emails, and I'm also like, I'm also fucking tired of that excuse. But me going like, okay, but like what Elon Musk is doing right now by unelectedly assuming federal pay systems and getting everyone's data,
so
that's on a scale like way larger.
Yeah.
At the same point, like you and I are in a position too where I'm like, I don't like our Constitution. I'm not one of these. We need to be a Constitution first left wing thing. In fact, I think the Constitution is a fucking problem, and I think everyone knows it. But how do you oppose the Constitution when the Constitution is just being ignored in a way that doesn't help you?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I'm interested to see how Mug kind of deals with that question, because I'm like, my position has always been like we can like defend like certain rights that are in the Constitution without like defending the Constitution itself. Like we can defend free speech without we'll still like saying we still need a new Constitution, but to the extent like we have rights in this society, like we should defend them.
Right. It's kind of like my response to the Gerald Horne versus Quist Catrone debate, which is I'm like, you're both partially right. There is a counter-revolutionary element to the American Revolution, but I'm also not willing to throw the entire revolution under the bus or pretend like even the American sans culotte just wanted in native lands and to hurt black people. I don't think the evidence is there for that. And there's one good book on it. I think it's The Many-Headed Hydra. I can't remember who wrote it, but
by Peter Linebaugh.
Yeah, I think that one's actually fair, and everyone else is either like American Revolution good, American Revolution counter-revolutionary.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on this one completely. Yeah,
like I don't think that's helpful here. Like, and I also think it does damage to your theory more than you let on, because even like Horn doesn't want to throw the French Revolution out. And I'm like, well, if I use the same criterion that you're using for the American Revolution on the French one, I throw the French one out too.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
the problem, is like you kind of also don't really get the French Revolution without the American Revolution.
right. It's just
at least
like,
the form book, especially. But
yeah, I mean, it's like, but like trying to claim that like the French Revolution had no settler content, and it's kind of like you just have to ignore history to say that. And
yeah,
they know
that is absolutely false to say that it was no colonial aspect of the French Revolution. Yeah,
I think it was more obviously divided than and I also think in the American Revolution, one of the things that even makes it more complicated, it's the more conservative side, like Adams, that actually have the more anti-slavery sentiment, which is part of what makes this strange to argue.
Yeah.
It's like you have Adams on one side and then like Tom Paine on the other, and they're they're like the abolitionists, and then like the center of the liberal, the liberal core of the Constitutionists are all like slavers. So it's just like, it's not a great look. But I do think we have to be honest about history. But America's a real hard thing, because one thing you and I both implied is all of left strategy, as understood from the internationals, was designed for European parliamentary systems. Like, they really weren't trying to. I mean, I don't even think they all understood the American congressional system. So like,
no, they didn't.
Even when I hear like Marx and Engels talk about America, sometimes I'm like, I don't think you realize how federated we are and how deep.
Yeah, and it's frustrating because Marx and Engels on America will have like some very insightful and interesting stuff, but then they'll just like completely get everything wrong. Like, listen, you don't actually understand how the system works.
Right. Well, to be fair, I don't think most people understand how
the
system works. Like, not just, most Americans don't, Europeans today kind of don't. When I like try to explain election laws to Europeans, they just look at me like we're insane. And I'm like, I know. Even our federal elections have 50 different sets of laws. I don't know what to tell you. Like, but yeah, it is fun. Well, thank you for coming on. Donald, where can people find your work? You're still doing stuff for Cosmonaut. I hear Cosmonaut might be gearing up, or what's going on there?
Well, probably by the time this comes out, the new Cosmonaut website will have been relaunched.
Oh, you're changing your design?
Yeah, we have a whole relaunch coming out. We have some new merch coming out. So there's kind of, I guess it's a soft relaunch, but yeah. So Cosmonaut magazine.
Yeah.
I'm obviously you can find me on Twitter at DonaldP1917. But obviously, thanks for having me on. I always have a great time talking, Varn.
Yeah, I like getting you guys on. I've become more and more sympathetic to Mug as we get older. My only thing is you're in the DSA. Which I'm trying. I like every now and then I'm like, I can get over it, and then like Groundwork posts something like, no, I can't.
Well, Cosmonaut magazine is completely independent from Mug, so you don't have to worry about anything and that being like DSA related.
I am gonna ask. I'm gonna tell you this. I'm asking the Mug Central Committee. I gotta actually email them tonight to come on the show to tell me what they think we should be doing in response to the current situation. Also considering that the DSA's, let's say, internal contradictions have become more apparent to even people in the DSA, and definitely to some people who are DSA watchers. And how you're going to orient around that. Because I do think the DSA is going to see a member bump, not like they did in the first Trump administration, where they grew from 20,000 to 90,000 very quickly. But yeah, it does seem like there's new numbers, but I have no idea how these numbers cut, because it's so hard to get where it's in some ways. I'd normally assume actually that the anti-Trump numbers would cut towards I won't use the term DSA right, even though I think it's applicable, but the electoralist, the like Democrat Party loyalist or whatever.
Yeah, but I think a lot of those people are mad at DSA and probably won't join. Honestly,
I mean, I think I mean, honestly, I think not just the DSA, but even the Justice Democrats have been sacrificed on that altar. So maybe it'll give people like some time to clarify. It's hard to know. Um, I will say that in 2022, I was surprised because I would have thought that it was the Democratic Party loyalists who stayed in the DSA, but actually the Biden administration seeming coming to power led a lot of them to like just become normal NGO types, and so
Yeah.
they left the organization. So
Yeah, and then when Palestine solidarity became like a liability, especially to a lot of those people, as you know.
oh yeah, that a lot of those people left. I'm sure.
Yeah, there are tons of public like I'm leaving DSA like op-eds and stuff published.
Yeah, well, I the thing is, okay, I don't want to get too much into DSA stuff, but and this is after the technical end of the show, but I did want to like, I found it funny that, you know, a lot of people are like, oh, there's tons of people leaving the DSA. And I looked at it, I'm like, well, actually, the ton of people that left the DSA actually seem to leave between 2020 and 2022, not between 2022 and 2024.
Yeah, I think
go ahead.
I think a lot of that was actually about Ukraine as well.
Yeah.
A lot of the more liberal type were mad that we didn't take like a more stridently pro-Ukraine position. They were kind of like, well, maybe neutrality is, you know, the better. We should just get this war over with as soon as possible and take a more neutral stance.
Yeah, I've had every now and then people get mad at me for not being more pro-Ukraine, and I'm just like, well, I'm not really pro-Russia. I do think they are the criminal instigators here, but I also understand why it happened, and I think basically the West used the Ukraine as a bait and was willing to sacrifice it. So
exactly, I feel like I've never been pro-Putin, but I'm like way more anti-Putin lately than I have been.
Yeah, I've noticed that. I've actually noticed our positions on Putin getting closer to each other.
Yeah, like,
like I mean, I've never been an Alex Reed Ross type, but I was really concerned about Putin and Dugin in like 2015, 2016, 2017. And like now I'm just like, I don't know, man. I think Dugin's actually kind of exhausted himself.
Yeah, he's kind of a laughing stock now. The stuff he's saying is just like,
even for him, all over the place.
Elon Musk is the new Caesar of the bro revolution. Like,
I'm just like, how is this fitting with your thaliocracy versus land empire shit? When you're
I know.
like,
there's so much. Like, it's like, dude, like this is supposed to be everything you were fighting against. Like,
right? Like, shouldn't you be mad that like the forces that you hate just teamed up with your guy? It's just like, okay, he doesn't believe. You and I have already indicated that when we talked about Dugin on the Putin versus Putin episode, but like, he doesn't really seem to believe in much. But anyway, people should check out Cosmonaut. I really enjoy it. I'll be covering more Cosmonaut articles here on Radical Engagements. I have at least 4 propped up, including the ones that you guys did on Bordiga, because some of the stuff published in Cosmonaut actually got to some Bordiga material and history that I didn't even know and haven't found in other places. So I want to give you guys that heads up, and I wish Mug luck in their battle in DSA. I recently had a Red Star member on. I haven't had anyone formally come on to represent Red Star, but I tried. But I've had a Red Star member come on, Sudeep Bhattacharya.
Yeah, no, I know him. Yeah, we're on the editorial committee for DSA publications.
Yep, and so so I'll be having more of the DSA types, and if someone from Groundwork or what's the other ones? I mean, I know there's all the Trotskyist ones too, like Reform and Revolution.
Yeah, Reform and Revolution. Yeah, no, they'd probably be down to have someone come on and talk about Trotsky.
Yeah, I like Reform and Revolution. I like the Communist Caucus, but they don't go on podcast.
Yeah, they're very anti-podcast.
It's weird to be grassroots and anti-media.
Yeah. Well, that's a whole other topic, is left-wing media and how we're losing the media game. But
oh well, I mean, the left-wing media, I think, has largely embarrassed itself by becoming grifts, and we have lost the media game.
Yeah.
But I've been unpopular for talking about how too many podcasts that seem to be all over the place is actually not a good thing. Look at the libertarians. Like, they used to dominate the podcast game. Now they don't exist.
Well, we've both been doing what we do here, for quite some time. So I think our respective projects are probably going to stand, the test of time.
Yeah, I was doing this when there was 4 of us or whatever. Like,
yeah,
God, like when I first entered podcasting, I think I'm about a decade older than you. I'm not going to out your age, but I think I am. When I first started doing podcasts, literally the only left podcasts were Doug Henwood's Pacifica Radio Show, Against the Grain, the Pacifica Radio Show, this one podcast called Seeing Red Radio that wasn't around for very long, Doug Lane's Diet Soap Part 1, and I guess Democracy Now. And that was it. Like, and that radically changed at the end after Occupy, and then really changed during the Trump administration. And we've seen some key shows come and go and come back, like Pearls of the Round Table.
Oh God, yeah.
That's my favorite one that I don't understand why it's popular. Deprogram's another that I don't listen to, but I hear a lot of people like it. I can't comment on it one way or the other. I do. Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of people who like it. It's it seems like it's pretty effective at reaching but not already engaged, like converted, I guess. Like it's kind of a But yeah, no, I think
the left media game's bad right now.
It is, but we're still in it, and we're not doing bad. I don't think.
No. I think you and I have both. I've weirdly I grew a lot during the first years of the Biden administration. I'm kind of at the same thing, but I don't lose a lot of subscribers either, despite the fact that I say outlandish stuff and piss people off all the time.
Yeah.
But one thing I say is, if you have an independent identity and people even if they disagree with you, even if they find you annoying, and many people find me annoying.
Yes.
At least they know that you mean what you say, and you're relatively consistent, and you're relatively open to alternative points of view, even if you don't agree with them, and you'll be that kind of stuff really matters.
Yes, people respect it.
I think the people who do the downstream from left punditry game, I think that shit doesn't go that well. And I think we've seen that in the free podcast. You and I have never been in the top 100 podcast, but we've seen with the exception of Chapo, which I still think is the most popular podcast on Patreon, or sometimes it's the second most, but it's either one or two. The downstream from Democrat left media punditry stuff has risen and fallen relatively quickly.
Yeah.
And I just think we should be careful with that, because now, where I used to see Crystal Ball or something in the top 20, now it's Candace Owens, Joe Rogan, more Candace Owens, Jordan Peterson. Sam Harris is the most left-wing thing I saw in the top 5. And I'm oh God.
Well, like you said, if you have an independent voice, you have interesting and compelling things to say that just come from a genuine belief, I think you will be able to kind of outlast those kind of ebbs and flows of left media popularity, so
yeah,
you won't be in the top 10 or whatever. You're not gonna become as popular as Joe Rogan, but you'll be able to have a lasting impact. You'll be able to influence people.
It's hard to become as popular as Joe Rogan, but also it helps to have started famous.
Yes.
I think we forget that Joe Rogan was famous for shit other than being a conspiracy theorist and a talk show host, before those things came into being.
Yeah.
But anyway, we're going to end. Thank you so much for coming on. And like I said, we'll have more, both Cosmonaut and I among people on in the future. And take care.
Thank you so much, Varn.